Welcome to Handmade Happenings. I'm Marissa and today I'm making yet another quilt. I've already done 3 this year, 4 if you count the mini one that I did, and I don't even like to quilt, so I really don't know how that happened. This one is going to be with a quilt panel. I saw this one that's a Thomas Kinkade print of a scene from the Disney Robin Hood movie. And after getting it, I decided to go the simple route of just putting a border around it. I started by trimming off the extra fabric around the panel using a rotary cutter, and somehow the edges still ended up just a little bit uneven. Next, I measured all the edges to determine how much of a border I needed. I decided to use a herringbone border because it kind of looks like arrows, which seems appropriate since this is a Robin Hood panel. For the fabric, I got 4 colors from the Connecting Threads Shimmer Tonals fabric collection. I pulled the colors from the panel, so it is 2 shades of green and a yellow and brown. I cut a strip from each color that was 4 inches tall by the width of the fabric. Then I trimmed off the selvage and cut it into 1 3/4 inch wide pieces. I did follow a tutorial for this, which I will link in the description, though I did change the measurements just a little. To assemble the pieces, I take one piece and sew the short edge of it to the long edge of another piece. And then from there, the new pieces are added along the longest edge, starting from the point and going down. I rotated through my 4 colors, changing every 2 pieces. As I did this, I just pressed the seams with my finger. I originally started pressing them open, but eventually switched to just pressing them to one side because it just made it easier when I went back and pressed it with the iron to really set the seams. After I used all of the pieces that I cut out initially, I measured the border and determined that cutting 1 more width of fabric for each of the colors should be enough to go all the way around. Once I had the length of border that I needed, I trimmed the long edges to even them out. This ended up giving me about a 4 1/4 inch wide border. I also straightened out one short edge. Then I laid out the panel and used it to cut a strip to the size of each of the 4 edges. I attached the top and bottom pieces, making sure that the points were going in opposite directions. I decided to put squares in the corners, so I cut them out of the fabric that I got for the backing and the binding, which is a light purple that is also a part of the Shimmer Tonal collection. And I didn't actually cut these as squares. I cut them at 4 1/4 by 4 1/2 inches, just in case my measurements were off, because I can always trim it if it's too big, but if it's too small, it's a lot harder to fix. So I attached a purple square on each end of the remaining border pieces. Then I attached them to the sides, lining up the seams where the purple was attached with the seam where the border and the panel were attached. And I trimmed off the excess purple fabric where needed. Now I'm making the quilt sandwich. This starts with laying out the backing, followed by the batting. I actually bought quilt batting this time instead of using fleece. And lastly, the quilt top. Now my quilt top was almost exactly 45 inches on the short side, which caused a bit of a problem because the backing was only 45 inches wide. So I don't have any excess to allow for the fabric shifting as I quilt it. And I had to leave the selvage edge on, which was also not ideal because one of those edges is a white strip that has like all of the fabric information on it. I did have excess on the long side though, and I trimmed that down a bit so that I wasn't dragging half a yard of excess fabric everywhere. Now it's time to quilt. Instead of doing an all-over quilting design, I decided to quilt around each character on the panel. Now this probably isn't considered good quilting because I think it's best practice to actually have stitching lines more frequently to help hold everything together. But I'm about to throw a lot of good habits out the door at this point. Because of the intricacies of following the shape of the characters, I decided it would be easiest to hand quilt this. I started using an oval hoop to keep the fabric taut and using quilting thread. I didn't get very far before changing both of these things. The hoop was just too big. I had to actually have something supporting the top edge because I couldn't hold it properly and still quilt. So I just switched that to a smaller circle hoop. Now the thread kept tangling and breaking even after running it through beeswax, plus I thought it was too visible and wanted it to blend in more. So I decided to switch to the only thread that I have a wide variety of colors in, which is Flourish. This probably isn't the best thread to use because it's softer and likely won't hold up to a lot of hardware. But that's okay because I plan to hang this on the wall. Using the flush allowed me to get a better match to the colors in the fabric, though I did find that each section tended to require multiple shades of different colors. So often the top of any character or outfit or whatever was lighter than the bottom because it's supposed to portray the difference in lighting. And I didn't film much of this process because it's just not that interesting, but I did take progress pictures as I finished each section. And I'll just let those play while I talk about some of my observations on this part of the process. Before I started this, I did look up a hand quilting tutorial, and it said to hide the knot by basically just pulling it through the top layer of the quilt. So I started out doing that, but eventually switched to pulling it through the backing instead, because on the top I was getting these just sometimes little snags in the fabric, which of course are very visible on a panel, whereas on the backing I didn't really have that problem, and even if I had, it just would have been less noticeable. I just used a running stitch for all of this, and I worked from the center out to the edges. I mainly went around the characters, and sometimes I would try and highlight some of the lines of movement like in the garments and stuff. And the level of detail just varied from spot to spot depending on how I felt at the time that I was working on it. I also went around some of the larger, more clearly defined objects like the rocks. I thought about doing the trees too because the trunks were large and well defined, but the limbs aren't as clear and I wasn't sure where the natural ending point would be. Once I had quilted everything I wanted to on the panel, I quilted around it on the stitching line where the border was attached. Since it's straight lines, I just did it on the machine. Then I trimmed off the excess batting and backing, and this is where I found that the backing had shifted in one spot, of course along that selvage edge, making it just a little too small. And we'll come back to that in a little. For now, I'm cutting out 2-inch strips of fabric for the binding. I sewed these together using a diagonal seam to reduce the bulk, and then pressed it in half. I attached it to the top of the quilt first. I'm pretty sure the tutorial I follow calls for it to be attached to the back. However, my quilt top was straighter and smoother than the backing was, so I figured it was best to sew it to the top first. The corner of the backing that I noticed had shifted earlier was too short to end up getting caught in the seam when I attached the binding. But thankfully the binding was wide enough that when I folded it over, it covered the raw edge of the backing. And I actually sewed it to the back by hand with a whip stitch to make sure that I caught the fabric in that spot. However, it wasn't wide enough to cover that white selvage edge. Since I put it at the top of the quilt and this is going to be hung on the wall, I figure it's least likely to be seen there. I haven't hung it on the wall yet because I don't have the stuff I need for it, but it is finally finished. Thank you for watching, and I hope you'll join me next time for another handmade happening.